Hi, today's topic is lean and agile supply chains. Before we can learn about lean and agile supply chains, let's try to understand what a supply chain is. Nigel Slack presents this model which shows how the strategic direction of an organization forces the organization to design the internal processes to deliver the strategy. And the aspect of delivery encompasses supply network management, capacity management, planning and control, lean synchronization, and inventory management. And these elements are the integral parts of a supply chain. Supply chain is all about meeting demand with capacity, bridging the gap between demand and supply. The economic principle states that there are unlimited wants but limited resources. The same principle applies to demand and supply. There's unlimited demand, but is a limited supply. So the focus of supply chain management is how to optimize and bridge the gap between demand and supply. So let's try to understand these 4 points. What is a supply chain? Objectives of a supply chain, decision phases in a supply chain, and process views of a supply chain. But first, let's find out what the problem with supply chains is. The problems of supply chain is about perception gaps. The gap between what your organization as a customer really wants and what your supplier thinks the organization wants. That is called the requirements perception gap. Likewise, the second gap is how your organization thinks the supplier is performing and how the supplier thinks it is performing. You may be thinking that your supply is not performing up to your expectations. However, the supplier may be thinking that it has bended its back to satisfy you. So this gap is called the fulfillment perception gap. These two gaps bring about two additional gaps. One called the supply improvement gap and the other the supply performance gap. Supply improvement gaps may be considered from the perspective of your organization as a customer, and the supply performance gap may be considered from the perspective of your supplier. Now, let's look at these two gaps from a different viewpoint. Let's assume your organization is a supplier to a customer. The same 4 gaps can be identified in this relationship as well. So when you put these two scenarios together, you see the complete picture. And right here in the middle is your organization. You perform as a supplier to your customer, and you become a customer to your supplier. And each of these relationships would have these gaps that needs to be understood, that needs to be analyzed and needs to be bridged. So what is supply chain management? Supply chain management is the flow of materials, the flow of information, and of course the supply of funds to manage these flows across the whole supply chain. And remember, supply chain has two ends. One is called the upstream, which is the supplier's end, and the other is the downstream, which is the customer's end. And in today's world, looking at your supplier and try to understand how your supplier performs is not sufficient, because supply chains are very complex. You will come across suppliers who have to depend on their suppliers for their performance. So your immediate supplier is called a first tier supplier, and his suppliers are called second tier, and his supplier would be the third tier. So it will go on, deeper and deeper into probably third, fourth, fifth, depending on the complexity of the supply chain. Likewise, you will have the first tier customer, which is the immediate customer of your organization. And if your customer is a business, he would obviously have his customers, who is termed the second tier customer, and it goes on, third tier, fourth tier. Now, supply chain management also can sometimes manage after-sales services, customer returns, product recycling. After-sales service is usually included in your product offer. And customer returns is something that is gaining ground. And with customer returns comes the complexity of managing reverse logistics. Reverse logistics means managing the movement of goods from the customer back to your organization. Product recycling has come to the fore because of the focus that most organizations have decided to give to the well-being of the environment. So recycling of used products and managing the recycling process has become part of supply chain management as well. Global supply chains is the order of the day. Supply chains extends its processes across frontiers, across borders, across countries. Today's organizations are global in nature. Very few organizations can claim that 100% of their operations are located in one geographical location. Most organizations tend to have one or two of the operations offshore. So global supply chains is an integrated process. So where several business entities such as suppliers, manufacturers, distributors, and retailers work together to plan, coordinate, and control materials, parts, and finished goods from suppliers to customers, as if these entities are part of your own organizations. Although legally they are not. They are separate legal entities. Therefore, supply chain management manages partnerships. Partnerships are very important because organizations tend to outsource a lot of their non-core activities, which do not use an organization's core competencies. They are better off outsourcing them two separate legal entities who are experts in these specific areas. When functions like these are outsourced, supply chains need to coordinate these processes and even manage inventories that are influenced by these separate legal entities. There are two kinds of supply chains. One is called the convergent supply chain, and the other a divergent supply chain. A classic example of a convergent supply chain is the supply chains of semi-finished products that goes into the assembly of the final finished product, which is a personal computer. Each of these components, like the case, the motherboard, drivers, display, keyboards, may be manufactured by different legal entities, different organizations, which means they will have their own unique supply chains. These supply chains converge into the supply chain of the final product, which in this case is a personal computer. A divergent supply chain works in the opposite direction. One unique product gets diverged into multiple components, and each component then acquires a supply chain that is unique to that particular product. An example of this is crude oil. Now let's look at supply chain and value stream. In a supply chain, as materials flow through operations, value accumulates. But the value diminishes when the supply chain becomes inefficient by incurring non-productive cost, additional storage and handling, and so forth. Again, when supply chains create waste, the value that accumulates as materials flow through operations diminishes. So when there's less waste within the organization, more productivity within the processes, there is a steep rise in the values. When organizations make profitability, this profitability has to be shared across all stages in the supply chain. It goes without saying, the higher the supply chain profitability, the more successful is the supply chain. But a success of a supply chain should be measured based on the supply chain profitability, the profitability of the entire supply chain, and not in terms of profits at individual stages. Now, this is extremely important for organizations. Traditionally, key performance indicators were set to measure performance for individual functions, which perhaps had no relevance to the objectives of another function. But if you have a supply chain mindset, then your objectives have to be aligned so that it reflects the entire supply chain performance. Now let's take a look at the decision phases in a supply chain. The three decision phases in a supply chain are aligned to the three hierarchical organization levels. The supply chain strategy design is aligned to the strategic level. Supply chain planning is aligned to the tactical level, and supply chain operation is aligned to the operational level. In today's business world, organizations should ideally have only these three levels. Any additional levels will be detrimental to an organization's lean initiatives, which we will be discussing as we go along. What are the process views of a supply chain? Generally, a supply chain is a sequence of processes and flows that takes place within and between different stages and functions of the supply chain. Now, the whole purpose of these activities that happen between and within the stages of a supply chain is to fulfill a customer request, a customer's request for a product or service. So there are two ways we can view the processes performed in a supply chain. And one process view is called the cycle view, and the other is a push-pull view. Now let us try to understand what a cycle view is. A supply chain is divided into a series of cycles. Example of a cycle is the customer order cycle. An order arrives, an order is processed. Likewise, we have a manufacturing cycle. An order is accepted, an order is pushed to the manufacturing plant to be produced, and the manufacturing plant uses that order to drive production. In a replenishment cycle, when an item reaches its reorder level in a warehouse, it triggers a replenishment order to replenish inventory. In a procurement cycle, when there is a need to procure raw materials, it triggers a purchase order, and the purchase order is sent to the supplier. While there is integration across these cycles, within a cycle, a specific task is done. Now let's look at a push-pull view of supply chains. If, for an example, the demand predictability of a particular product is low, if you are not sure of the sales potential of a particular product, it doesn't make sense to manufacture that product or procure that product and keep it in inventory. Therefore, the arrival of a customer order will trigger the manufacturing process of such a product, as well as the procurement process of the raw materials that are required to manufacture such a product. If the product is procured and sold, then the arrival of an order for such a product would trigger the procurement process. Now, the point at which it triggers the manufacturing or the procurement process is called the decoupling point. In the case of this example, the decoupling point is at the extreme left. The entire manufacturing procurement cycles are triggered when a customer order arrives and not before. The processes that are right of the decoupling point are called pull processes, because these are pulled by the customer, and these processes only gets activated when a customer order arrives. Now let's assume that there is a product which has a high predictability of demand. In this case, the organization would decide to manufacture or procure the product and then keep it in inventory because of the fact that demand is highly predictable for this product. This will obviously be a fast moving item. So it makes sense for an organization to hold inventory of this product. Now, in this case, the decoupling point is at the extreme right. All the processes left to the decoupling point are called push processes, which means the processes push the product in anticipation of demand. So these are the two extremes of the push-pull view of supply chains. But in most cases, the decoupling point of products lie between the two extremes. For example, at a McDonald's outlet, the semi-finished cooked food are made available awaiting a customer order. When the customer order comes in, the semi-finished items are used to assemble the final product and give it to the customer. So the semi-finished products are manufactured and kept in inventory in anticipation of demand, while as the final product, that is the hamburger, is assembled and given to the customer after the customer places an order. So the assembly of the hamburger uses a pull process, whereas the manufacture and storage of the raw materials and the semi-finished components that goes into a hamburger uses the push process. Functional products, which has a high demand predictability, are procured and manufactured using physically efficient supply chains, which means efficient supply chains concentrate on bulk procurement or mass manufacturing to take advantage of economies of scale. You can only do that for products that have high demand predictability, and functional products do have high demand predictability. Innovative products, on the other hand, do not have high demand predictability. Their predictability is very low. You're not sure whether innovative products will be sold today or tomorrow or next week or next month. So therefore, it makes sense for innovative products to be manufactured and procured once the customer order is received. This means your supply chain should be market responsive to be able to supply innovative products. Let's look at the supply chain macro processes. There are three macro processes in a supply chain: the supplier, the firm or an organization, and the customer. So let's look at supplier and the supplier relationship management macro processes. This process deals with the supplier, and the activities that goes into supplier relationship management are sourcing, negotiating, buying, design collaboration, and supply collaboration. Out of these, you need to understand the difference between design collaboration and supply collaboration. Supply collaboration is pretty simple. You collaborate with the supplier or you get your supplier to collaborate with you so that they can supply you the raw materials that you require on time. For that, you may have to share information of your internal process with your supplier so that they can make better judgments as to what quantities need to be supplied and at what time. Now, design collaboration is slightly different to supply collaboration. Design collaboration is the collaboration that happens when your organization decides to change your product specs to suit the raw materials that are already available with the supplier and which are supplied to other customers as well. This will ensure that the costs of raw materials are optimized by using a readily available raw material rather than decide to source a unique raw material or raw materials that will be sold to you at a premium price because you will be the only customer who will be using that raw material. Now let's look at the next supply chain macro process, which is ISCM, short form for internal supply chain management. This is straightforward. Strategic planning, demand planning, supply planning, fulfillment, field service all falls under internal supply chain management. These are all the internal processes that are required to run your supply chain efficiently. The next macro process is the customer relationship management macro process. In here, your organization would be looking at the market, pricing, selling processes, call center management, and order management. The next slide shows you in graphical form what the supply chain process model is. If you look at the bottom 4 categories, that supports sourcing, making, and delivering, which are the main components in a supply chain. Information technology, human resources, finance, technology supports these 3 activities in a supply chain. And to make these 3 activities efficient, you would need further sub-activities like planning, supply management, logistics, distribution, customer service management, and on top you would have the different functions that will be in your organization managing these activities. This is a framework for structuring supply chain drivers, which is very important. There are 2 categories of drivers. One is called the logistical drivers and the other cross-functional drivers. Logistical drivers are tangible drivers. Like facilities, you need a place to operate your organization from. You need your manufacturing plant. You need your warehouses. Inventory, you will require your products to be inventorized in anticipation of demand, and you would also require transportation to distribute or deliver your products to the customer, and even to move goods from your supplier to your organization. The cross-functional drivers are information. You need information to manage your logistical drivers. You need sourcing decisions. You need pricing decisions. And all these supply chain drivers would operate in an efficiency responsiveness spectrum. Efficiency would mean that you will be looking at push processes, and responsiveness would mean you will be looking at pull processes. Supply chain management has evolved from the 1950s, from traditional mass manufacturing to the 21st century, where we look at agile and lean supply chains. Now, to create a physically efficient and lean supply chain, we need to take into consideration the 7 supply chain ways. We need to incorporate lean thinking into your organization. We need to look at improving the value stream by identifying non-value added activities in your processes. We need to encourage just-in-time philosophy, where your organization only produces or procures what is actually pulled by the customer, and your organization create a physically efficient supply chain through collaboration. Out of all these, the most important element is the focus on 7 supply chain ways. These are overproduction, waiting time, transportation waste, inappropriate processing, unnecessary processing, unnecessary motion, and defects. Overproduction would mean producing what is not wanted. Waiting is idle time. Idle time is considered waste. Time is money. Transportation. The most efficient modes of transportation that should be used to move goods from point A to point B needs to be decided on. Inappropriate processing. Are standards used when activities are done in your internal processes? Unnecessary processing. Are the activities that are done in some of your processes necessary? Are they adding value? Unnecessary motion. When moving items from point A to point B, can this be done in a much more efficient manner? And defects. Are your products defective? And if so, how many defects have you experienced in your product portfolio? Is there a mechanism in place to identify defects before it reaches the customer? Do you have a process of focusing on preventing defects rather than appraising items just to check to say whether they conform to standards? So key operations questions that needs to be asked is, what is lean synchronization in supply chains? How does lean synchronization eliminate waste? And how does lean synchronization apply throughout the supply network? The key principle of lean operations is relatively straightforward. It means we move towards elimination of all waste in order to develop an operation that is faster, more dependable, produces high quality products and services, and above all operates at low cost. So these are some of the ways that lean operations can be managed. Continuous flow manufacture, high value added manufacture, stockless production, we don't hold inventory. Low inventory production, we may have to have inventory, but inventory will always be optimized. Fast throughput manufacturing, there's no delays between activities in the manufacturing process. Lean manufacturing, where we have identified non-value added activities in the manufacturing process, and we use Toyota production system, which is developed by Toyota and was instrumental in presenting the concepts of continuous improvement. And look at short cycle time manufacturing. Now let's look at some of these activities that promotes lean manufacturing. Just-in-time material flow. The traditional approach is you always had buffer inventory between two stages. But the JIT, or the just-in-time approach, will only manufacture when there is room in the next stage to continue the manufacturing without stopping it. So in stage A, you wait for the call from stage B to manufacture and move the products to stage B. So likewise, if you have multiple activities, multiple processing points, you will not have a situation where you have buffer inventory, which tends to delay the entire process and which hinders an organization's ability to compute throughput time, lead times in appropriate manner. Lean operations. The traditional approach is you focus on high capacity utilization. It is all about productivity, it is all about machine utilization. But in the lean approach, you focus on producing only what is needed. Nothing more, nothing less. So inventories of materials, information, or customers have similar characteristics. This table gives you the characteristics of cost, space, quality, decoupling, utilization, coordination of materials, of information, of customers. What is value stream mapping? Value stream mapping is a method of mapping all the activities in a process so that all activities becomes visible, in order that you may question each of these activities. You question whether each of these activities is adding value to the process, or are they not value added? Are they there just because it has been there for so many years? So this is a little bit of a revolutionary process. Value stream mapping is being done now in a lot of organizations to identify non-value added activities. So the areas where waste is created can be identified by using value stream mapping methods. These are some of the examples that are there, which shows how value stream mapping is used to identify waste or waiting time. Waiting time is waste. And if you take the waiting time out, the normal throughput time was 258 hours for this particular map that is drawn for an industrial air conditioning installation service. It reduces to 8 hours. So that's a significant reduction of waiting time. Then it's important to consider delivering smaller quantities more rather than embarking on bulk manufacturing. The traditional method of bulk manufacturing and bulk storage has a lot of issues relating to creation of waste. So these are some of the symbols that he used to map out activities in order to identify non-value added activities that create waste. Overproduction, waiting time, transport, process, inventory, motion, defective goods. And these influence the throughput efficiency. Now, traditionally, organization thought inventory was a good thing. But in today's world, consultants have shown that inventory hides a lot of ills. When there's more inventory, the real problems are made invisible because of the fact that you have inventory. But the moment the inventory levels are moved down, the problems that have been submerged due to inventory becomes visible. More and more organizations are moving into manufacturing in small machines because then it will not be necessary to focus on machine utilization. That will finally create massive amounts of products that will go and sit in inventory. So managing inventory levels has become a foremost priority for a lot of organizations. Using several smaller machines rather than one large machine allows simultaneous processing and is claimed to be more robust and is more flexible, and it helps manage inventory very well. The batch flow principle that was used by a lot of manufacturing organizations in the past has been proved to be inefficient. Because in a batch flow, you only concentrate on one activity at a time. Whereas in a continuous flow, activities are done simultaneously to reduce and optimize throughput time. This is another example of how level scheduling and batch flows have been replaced by flow principles. Simultaneous activities enhances efficiency of processes. Thank you.